I remember the day my daughter told me she was pregnant. It was a Sunday afternoon, one of those soft, almost sleepy days when the light drapes across the living room like a tired curtain. I was sitting in my old recliner, the one with the stitched arm that never quite matched the original leather when she called. Her voice was high-pitched, trembling in that way joy often disguises itself as nervousness. "Dad," she said, "I've got news." For a moment, I thought she'd gotten a promotion. She'd been climbing the ladder in her office, always working late, chasing the kind of success that makes parents both proud and worried. But it wasn't that. "I'm pregnant," she whispered. There was silence on my end, not because I didn't know what to say, but because my chest felt suddenly too full, as if my ribs couldn't contain the memory of holding her as a baby all over again. In that instant, the little girl who once wrapped her tiny fingers around my thumb became a mother-to-be. "Sweetheart," I said, clearing my throat, that's the best news I've heard in years." And I meant it. I hadn't realized how much I'd been waiting for this moment. The chance to be a grandfather, to carry a baby in my arms again and tell stories no one asked for. The kind of stories kids roll their eyes at but secretly tuck into their hearts. She laughed softly, relieved. Then her tone shifted, almost like she had been holding something back. "We're having a baby shower. It's going to be really modern, Dad. You know, trendy Daker, photo booth, brunch style, all that. My friends are organizing it." "Modern," I repeated, smiling. "Well, whatever you like, tell me what I can do." And then came the words that stuck like a shard of glass. "Dad, you don't have to come, just maybe help cover the costs. My friends will handle everything else." For a second I thought I had misheard. "Not come," I repeated. "Why wouldn't I?" She rushed in too quickly. "It's not that, Dad, it's just you wouldn't be comfortable. The music, the decorations, the vibe, my friends, they are modern, and you—" She paused, and when she spoke again the word carved into me like a slow blade. "You're not." I swallowed. "Not modern," I said, as if tasting the phrase might change its meaning. "I mean, you're wonderful, Dad." She added quickly, "But you're old-fashioned. It's not a bad thing, it's just different, outdated, unnecessary." Words with the same root but different daggers. I forced a laugh. "Well," I said, "if paying the bill keeps me useful, I'll do that." She didn't laugh back. She simply said, "Thanks, Dad. It really means a lot," before hanging up. And that was it. I sat there for a long time after, the phone heavy in my palm, as if its weight alone could anchor me to the world that had just shifted. My daughter was about to celebrate the creation of a new family, a new life, and I wasn't invited. The irony cut deep. When she was 7, I had strung balloons in our cramped living room, twisting them into sloppy arches while she giggled and clapped. I had worn a paper hat, cooked spaghetti from scratch because it was her favorite, and pretended the cake from the discount bakery was the fanciest thing money could buy. Her eyes had sparkled that night, not because it was modern, but because it was ours. Now, all these years later, the same little girl told me I wasn't modern enough to stand in the room where she would celebrate her own child. That night, I poured myself a glass of water and sat by the window. Outside, the world was buzzing with neon lights and cars that drove themselves, phones that spoke back to you, music that sounded more like static than songs. I thought about what modern really meant. Maybe it meant being sleek, stylish, quick to adapt. Maybe it meant trading comfort for aesthetics, roots for trends. And maybe, just maybe, it meant fathers like me were slowly being edged out of the picture, like an old photograph that doesn't quite fit into the new frame. I remembered my own father. He never once attended a school event of mine, not because he didn't love me, but because in his time fathers didn't. They worked. They provided. They stayed in the shadows. I swore I'd be different. I promised myself I'd be present, loud, embarrassing if I had to, just so my daughter knew she mattered. Now here I was, being asked to step back into the shadows. Maybe this is just the way the world moves on. I muttered aloud, though the only one listening was the old clock ticking on the mantel. I wanted to call her back, to argue, to remind her of every scraped knee I had patched, every shift I had worked to pay for her college, every bedtime story told when I was dead on my feet. But love doesn't always protest. Sometimes it just nods, agrees, and bleeds quietly in the dark. So instead, I whispered into the stillness as if she could hear me anyway. "Sweetheart, I'll give you what you ask for, but don't ever think my love is too old to matter." Later that night, I opened my laptop, something I used mostly for bills and the occasional weather report. I typed into the search bar, "modern baby shower ideas." Photos exploded on the screen. Balloon garlands cascading like waterfalls, grazing tables of exotic cheeses, floral backdrops, gender-neutral pastels. It all looked so foreign to me, a stage set for an audience I didn't belong to. I tried to picture myself there. Would I stand awkwardly near the punch bowl, not knowing the songs, not recognizing the faces? Would my daughter introduce me as her dad, or would she avoid eye contact, embarrassed by my plaid shirt and worn shoes? The answer hurt more than the question. I went to bed that night with a knot in my chest, the kind that pulls tighter the more you try to ignore it. Before I closed my eyes, I reached for the photo on my nightstand. My daughter at 5 years old, missing a front tooth, frosting smeared across her cheeks from the cake I baked. She was holding my hand like it was the only anchor in the world. Back then, I was enough. Now, I wasn't modern enough. Pushpin, if you've ever felt like the world moved too fast and left you behind, if you've ever wondered whether love has an expiration date, stick with me in this story. And if you find a piece of yourself here, consider liking and subscribing. It helps more people hear stories like this, and it reminds me I'm not alone in telling them. As I drifted into restless sleep, one thought echoed louder than the rest. I would not fight my daughter's decision, but I would not let the story end with me standing outside, uninvited either. Something inside me whispered that love, real love, wasn't about being modern. It was about being timeless. And though I didn't yet know how, I promised myself I would find a way to remind her of that. When I was a younger man, I used to think birthdays were the biggest deal in the world. Maybe that's because we didn't have much else to celebrate. My daughter's 7th birthday was the one I remember most. The house smelled like spaghetti sauce because I had left it simmering since the morning, hoping the aroma would make our tiny apartment feel festive. I had bought a pack of balloons at the corner store, red, yellow, blue, $1 a bag. I remember sitting on the floor, dizzy from blowing them up one by one. My cheeks ached and my head spun, but every time another balloon floated to the ceiling, my daughter clapped her hands like I had just pulled a rabbit out of a hat. "Higher, Dad, make it go higher," she squealed, chasing after them as if they were magic. I wore a silly paper hat. It dug into my forehead, leaving a crease I didn't notice until later in the mirror. The cake, lopsided and slightly burnt on one side, sat proudly in the middle of our scratched wooden table, but she didn't care. When I placed that cake in front of her, lit 7 crooked candles and sang off-key, she looked at me like I had given her the world. That night, as I tucked her into bed, she whispered, "This was the best birthday ever, Daddy." And I believed her. Now, decades later, I couldn't help but compare that memory with the pictures she sent me from her phone last week. She had forwarded me an album of inspiration her friends had shared for the baby shower. Glossy balloon garlands in pastel colors, giant golden letters spelling baby, charcuterie boards with cheeses I couldn't pronounce, a photo station framed in roses and eucalyptus leaves. Everything looked like it belonged in a magazine. I stared at the images, half amazed, half saddened. Somewhere in that beautiful perfection, I tried to imagine my little girl laughing, chasing after dollar store balloons and declaring it the best day ever. But that version of her seemed to have vanished into adulthood, replaced by someone who cared about hashtags and themes. I spent the next day wandering through a party supply store, one of those cavernous places where aisles were stacked higher than I could reach. There were banners with cursive lettering, cupcake wrappers with gold trim, plastic champagne flutes that looked like crystal. As I shuffled past shelves, I heard 2 young women talking a few feet away. "Everything has to be aesthetic," one said. "Like if it's not Instagram-worthy, what's the point?" Her friend laughed. "Exactly. My cousin had one last month and it looked so basic. Nobody even posted about it." I must have looked out of place, an older man in a flannel shirt staring blankly at sequined tablecloths because one of the clerks came up to me. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked kindly. I hesitated, then mumbled, "Just looking. My daughter's having a baby shower." "Oh, how wonderful!" Her face lit up. "What's the theme?" "The theme," I repeated. "Yes, woodland creatures, boho chic, minimalist neutral, you know the vibe." I didn't know any of it. I forced a smile, shook my head, and walked out empty-handed. That night I called my daughter. "I thought I'd pick something up for the shower," I said carefully. "Maybe balloons or decorations." She sighed. "Dad, I told you, my friends are handling everything. It's all coordinated. It has to look a certain way, otherwise it won't make sense. Just send money, okay?" Her words were casual, but each one landed heavy. "Of course," I said softly. "Money it is. Thanks, Dad, you're the best." And then she hung up. The best. A hollow crown placed on my head while my hands were tied. Later that evening, I dug through an old box in the attic. Inside were photographs, her as a child, holding balloons that barely floated, blowing out candles on uneven cakes. And tucked into one corner was a deflated red balloon from that 7th birthday, the knot still tied, shriveled into rubber wrinkles. I held it in my hand for a long time, wondering what she would say if I showed up with it now. Would she laugh at the sentiment, or cringe at the thought that her friends might see something so outdated? I think the hardest part of parenthood is realizing that what once made your child glow now makes them roll their eyes. I'm not angry about it. I know time changes us all, but there's a quiet ache in feeling like your love hasn't evolved enough to keep up. Sometimes I wonder if love should have to evolve at all. The next weekend, I stopped by her house. She wasn't home, but I noticed the porch had boxes stacked high. Amazon packages with neat labels. Supplies for the shower, no doubt. I crouched down, peeking at the contents of one box. Inside were pale pink plates with gilded edges, napkins embossed with tiny footprints, and an instruction sheet about how to set up a balloon arch. An arch. Perfect, seamless, elegant. Nothing like the lopsided balloons I once tied to our kitchen chairs. I left before she returned. That night, as I washed the dinner dishes in my quiet kitchen, I found myself whispering to the empty room, "She doesn't need my balloons anymore." The faucet dripped in reply. But deep down, I promised myself something. I would not stop trying. Even if my balloons no longer floated high enough, even if my cake was crooked, even if my presence embarrassed her, I would keep showing up in my own way. Because that's what fathers do. When I was younger, my father used to tell me, "A man's worth is measured by what he provides." I believed that for a long time. I worked long hours, gave up weekends, took jobs I didn't like just to make sure my daughter never went without. But now, sitting at the kitchen table with a bill the size of a small mortgage staring up at me, I began to wonder if maybe my father's lesson had been too simple. Because what happens when all you can give, the money, the provision, is accepted, but the rest of you, the heart of you, is left behind? A week after our last conversation, my daughter sent me a spreadsheet. Yes, an actual spreadsheet. Each line was neatly categorized: catering, decorations, custom invitations, dessert table, photographer, venue rental. The total cost, highlighted in cheerful yellow, was just over $3,000. At the bottom, she had written, "If you can cover this, Dad, that would be amazing. Thank you, heart suit." I stared at the numbers, then at the tiny heart emoji, as if it could soften the fact that I was funding a party I wasn't welcome to attend. I sighed, rubbed my forehead, and reached for my checkbook. The act felt mechanical, like paying taxes or settling a parking ticket. But the ache that followed was anything but mechanical. It was human. It was raw. That weekend, I decided to buy a gift. Something personal, something from me. I walked into a baby store, bright, cheerful, every aisle lined with items that whispered promises of comfort. Soft blankets, cribs polished like ivory, stuffed animals with sewn-on smiles. The air smelled faintly of talcum powder, like a memory of nurseries long gone. A young couple brushed past me, laughing, holding hands, pointing at strollers that looked fancier than my first car. I felt invisible, a relic wandering among gadgets I didn't understand. Still, I kept walking until I found a shelf stacked with baby carriers. Modern design, sleek, with straps and buckles like military gear. And then tucked away on the bottom row I spotted something else, a simple wooden rattle. It looked old, out of place. The kind of toy I would have bought 30 years ago. I picked it up, rolled it in my palm, felt the grain of the wood. I imagined my grandchild clutching it, drooling on it, shaking it with laughter. It wasn't sleek. It wasn't trendy. But it was real. I carried it to the counter, my heart oddly full. When I showed the rattle to my daughter a few days later, her reaction landed like a hammer on fragile glass. "Dad," she tilted her head the way people do when they're trying to be gentle. "This is sweet, but it's not really safe, you know, with splinters and all. And honestly, it doesn't fit. We're going for more modern stuff." "Safe?" I asked. I sanded it down myself. "There's not a rough edge on it," smiled tightly. "It's not about that, it's just people don't use things like this anymore." "People," I echoed, "or you." She looked away. "Dad, I don't want my friends thinking," she trailed off, but I knew the end of the sentence. Thinking what? That her father was outdated, that he didn't belong. I slipped the rattle back into my pocket. "Of course," I said quietly. "I understand." That night I put the rattle on my nightstand. It stared at me like a small, wooden witness to the widening gap between us. I thought about throwing it away, but something in me resisted. It wasn't just a toy, it was a piece of me, solid, imperfect, enduring. A few days later, I stopped by her house again to drop off the check for the baby shower expenses. She wasn't home, but the door was unlocked, so I left it on the kitchen counter, weighted down with a salt shaker so it wouldn't flutter off. As I turned to leave, I heard voices, hers and a friend's, coming from the back patio. I froze. They were laughing, sipping something in tall glasses. "Your dad's really paying for all of this?" her friend asked. "Yeah," my daughter said with a shrug. "I mean, honestly, if it weren't for him, we couldn't even afford half of it." "Wow, that's generous." She laughed again, lighter this time. "Yeah, well, it's the least he can do. He's not really, you know, baby shower material." They both giggled. I felt the air leave my lungs. The least he can do. I backed away before they saw me, my shoes careful on the linoleum. I slipped out the front door into the quiet street, carrying the weight of their words like stones in my chest. On the drive home, I tried to reason with myself. She didn't mean it the way it sounded. She was under pressure, surrounded by friends, swept up in a world I didn't understand. But no matter how many excuses I invented, the words clung stubbornly to me. The least he can do. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. Maybe she was right. Maybe money was the only currency I had left in this relationship. Maybe love, messy, outdated, unphotogenic, wasn't enough anymore. That night, I pulled the rattle from my pocket again. I turned it over in my hands, wondering if my grandchild would ever touch it, or if it would remain just another artifact of a man who loved too clumsily. I set it back down, and as I did, I whispered, almost in defiance, "Maybe it's the least I can do, but it's not the only thing I can do." The rattle gleamed faintly in the lamplight as if it agreed. I went to bed that night with a quiet resolve. I would keep giving money, yes, if that's what she needed, but also the kind of gifts no one asked for, the ones carved out of memory, patience and stubborn devotion. Because love, even when unwelcome, deserves to be present. And I wasn't done being a father yet. Grief doesn't vanish. It lingers like perfume in an old sweater. You think it's gone, and then one quiet evening it sneaks back in, subtle and sharp, reminding you of what you lost. My wife had been gone for over a decade, but some nights I still set the table for two. Not on purpose, it was habit. A fork here, a plate there, until I'd look up and realize the chair opposite me was empty. Then I'd put the plate back, shake my head, and eat my dinner in silence. That night, after overhearing my daughter's words, "He's not baby shower material," I felt her absence more than ever. If my wife were still here, she would have known what to say. She always had a way of bridging the gap between me and our daughter, smoothing the rough edges I left behind. She was modern in her own way, stylish but modest, gentle but firm. She could have walked into that baby shower with her head high, blending seamlessly with the pastel banners and curated playlists, and my daughter would have been proud to introduce her. But me, I was the one asked to stay home. I sat in the living room, the checkbook still open on the table, when my eyes drifted to the photograph on the mantel. My wife, smiling in a sundress, her hair caught by the breeze. She had been gone so long that sometimes I forgot the sound of her laugh. But the photo always brought it back, faint but insistent, like a seashell echoing the ocean. I stood, walked over, and picked up the frame. "Well," I said to her picture, "you know how to handle this, wouldn't you? You know how to remind her without pushing too hard. Me, I keep messing it up." The silence in the room felt heavier than her answer ever would have been. "She says I'm not modern," I continued. My voice cracked on the word. "As if love needs to keep up with the times. As if balloons and music mean more than—" I stopped, pressing my lips together. I thought of that wooden rattle sitting on my nightstand, small and unassuming. I imagined her face if she were here to see it. She would have smiled, touched my hand, and whispered, "It's perfect. Don't doubt yourself." I sank into the recliner, still clutching the photo frame. For a long time I just sat there, staring at her eyes frozen in time, wondering what advice she would give me if she could. Memories began to tumble in, uninvited but unstoppable. The first time we brought our daughter home from the hospital. My wife cradling her, me fumbling with the car seat straps, both of us laughing at my incompetence. The night she stayed awake, rocking the baby to sleep, humming lullabies while I stumbled around the kitchen making weak coffee. The afternoon she would sew tiny dresses, patching them with love when money was tight. She had been the glue. Without her, I sometimes felt like a puzzle missing half its pieces. I whispered to the photo, "I don't know how to be enough for her anymore. I tried money, but that only made me invisible. I tried a gift, but it made me embarrassing. What else can I give?" Of course, the photo stayed silent, but somewhere in the back of my mind her voice rose up, calm and steady. "Give her yourself, the part of you that doesn't go out of style." I didn't sleep much that night. I tossed, turned, replayed the conversation on the patio again and again. The least he can do. By morning, exhaustion settled into my bones, but so did a strange kind of clarity. If money and modern trinkets weren't enough, then I would give something else, something timeless, something made of my hands, my history, my heart. That afternoon, I drove to the old craftsman's shop downtown. Dust coated the windows and the smell of varnish lingered in the air. The owner, a man older than me, nodded when I entered. "What can I do for you?" he asked. "I need wood," I said. "Something strong, something that lasts." He raised an eyebrow, building a chair. I hesitated. "No, a gift." He didn't press for details. He just led me to the back, where planks of oak and maple leaned against the wall like forgotten soldiers. I ran my hand over one piece of oak, smooth but sturdy. It reminded me of the rocking chair I had once built for my wife when she was pregnant. She used it every night, rocking our daughter to sleep. I bought the plank, loaded it into my truck, and drove home. In my garage, I set up my old tools, the saw, the chisels, the sandpaper. My hands were clumsy at first, but muscle memory returned slowly like an old friend. I decided to make a keepsake box, something my daughter could place in the nursery. Not flashy, not modern, but solid. A box to hold the first lock of hair, the first lost tooth, the first tiny socks outgrown too quickly. As I worked, the sound of the saw and the smell of oak filled the air, reminding me of nights long ago when I built that rocking chair. My wife's laughter echoed in my memory, urging me on. By midnight, the rough shape of the box sat on my workbench. My hands were blistered, my back sore, but my heart felt lighter than it had in weeks. I ran my fingers over the unfinished surface and whispered to the empty garage, "This is what I can give. Not money, not modernity, just me." I placed the unfinished box on the table, wiped my brow, and looked at my wife's photo again. "I don't know if she'll accept it," I admitted softly, "but at least she'll know I'm still here." Her eyes, frozen in that eternal smile, seemed to agree. The Saturday of the baby shower came dressed in sunshine. The kind of sunshine that seems to insist life is beautiful, no matter who's included in it and who's left out. I woke early, though I had no reason to. My house was silent except for the ticking clock, each second reminding me of what I would not be doing that day. I made coffee but couldn't taste it. My hands shook as I buttoned my shirt, not because I had anywhere to go, but because routine can sometimes trick you into thinking you belong somewhere. By noon, I found myself driving aimlessly. I told myself I just needed air, but my steering wheel seemed to know the direction better than I did, because somehow I ended up a block away from the rented hall where the baby shower was being held. I parked across the street, my old truck looking like a relic beside rows of polished SUVs and shiny sedans. Through the wide glass windows of the venue, I saw pastel balloons arched perfectly, tables draped in linen, guests in carefully chosen outfits. My daughter was in the center of it all, glowing, laughter spilling out of her like confetti. I wanted to be happy for her, and I was, but happiness and heartbreak can sit in the same chest, and that day they did. I couldn't walk in. I wasn't invited. I wasn't modern enough. So I turned into the small cafe next door, one of those places with chalkboard menus and mismatched mugs. I ordered black coffee, though I didn't want it, and sat by the window with the perfect view of the party I couldn't attend. From my seat, I could hear muffled music, the kind with heavy bass and lyrics I couldn't quite understand. Through the glass, I watched people taking photos at a floral backdrop, champagne glasses raised. My daughter posed with her friends, her hands on her belly, the baby's presence celebrated by everyone but me. My phone buzzed. It was a notification from social media. Against my better judgment, I opened it. There she was, my daughter, smiling, radiant, surrounded by her friends. The caption read, "Family is what you make it. Here's to new beginnings with my little one. Hash modern baby shower, hash new chapter. Family is what you make it." The words landed heavy. I was her family. I had always been. But in that room, I was a ghost. I scrolled through the comments. Stunning. So modern and chic. Obsessed with this vibe, not one word about her father, not one sign that I even existed. I set the phone down, my hand trembling. In the reflection of the cafe window, I saw myself, older, worn, a man with lines etched deeper by disappointment than by age. The waitress approached. She was young, maybe college-aged, with freckles across her cheeks. "Everything okay, sir?" she asked kindly. I forced a smile. "Yes, thank you." She hesitated. "Are you waiting for someone? You keep looking out the window." I swallowed, the words catching in my throat. "No, I guess I'm just remembering." She nodded, though she clearly didn't understand, and left me to my solitude. Memories flooded in uninvited. I remembered standing in a gymnasium years ago, cheering for my daughter during her school play. She had played a tree, just a tree, but I clapped as if she were the star. I remembered driving her to prom, her dress glittering under the streetlights, her nervous laughter filling the car. I remembered walking her into her college dorm, carrying more boxes than my back could handle, refusing to let her see me wince. In all those moments I had been there, present, embarrassing maybe, old-fashioned definitely, but there. Now I was across the street sipping cold coffee, watching strangers celebrate my grandchild. The music from the hall grew louder, spilling into the cafe. Someone must have opened the door. Laughter drifted out with it, bright and carefree. And then for a split second I heard her voice, my daughter's voice, calling out with delight. I closed my eyes. For that moment I pretended it was me she was calling, that I was walking into the room carrying balloons, her eyes lighting up at the sight of me. But when I opened them, all I saw were strangers. A man at the counter glanced at me. "Hey, aren't you supposed to be at that party?" he asked casually, pointing with his chin toward the hall. I froze. "Why do you say that?" "You keep staring out the window like you're waiting to be invited," he said with a chuckle. "Looks like you're missing out on something fun." I forced another smile, but my voice cracked when I replied, "Maybe I am." He shrugged and turned back to his coffee. To him, it was small talk. To me, it was salt on an open wound. After an hour, the party seemed to peak. Guests spilled out onto the sidewalk laughing, carrying little gift bags. I caught sight of my daughter again, her hand brushing her stomach as she laughed at something a friend whispered. She looked so happy, so radiant. And for the first time, I realized my heart could break and swell with pride at the exact same moment. I left the cafe quietly, unnoticed. the bell above the door jingling my silent exit. As I walked to my truck, the waitress from earlier called after me. "Sir, you forgot your change." I waved her off. "Keep it," I said, because the truth was I hadn't forgotten my change. I just didn't feel like I had any left in me. I used to believe love was measured in sweat. When my daughter was small, I worked 2 jobs. By day, I fixed engines at a local garage. By night, I stocked shelves at a grocery store. My hands were always coated in grease or dust, my back permanently bent. But every time I walked through our front door and heard her giggle from the living room, it was worth it. Back then, money was never enough. Rent was late more than once. Bills piled up like unwanted visitors. But I told myself, as long as she never feels the hunger, as long as she never sees the worry, I'm doing my job. And I did. She had birthdays with cakes, even if I burned them. She had shoes, even if they weren't brand names. She had school supplies, even if I had to pawn my guitar to pay for them. I thought of all this as I sat in my empty house the evening after the baby shower. The silence felt heavier than ever. On the table lay my old work gloves. I kept them even after retirement, though the leather was cracked and the stitching frayed. I slipped them on, flexing my fingers. They didn't fit quite right anymore, but the memories fit perfectly. Every blister, every callus, every paycheck folded into a birthday card. It all told the same story. I gave her everything I had. But as I scrolled through the photos from the shower, the glossy smiles and curated perfection, I realized none of that mattered anymore. No one posts about calloused hands on Instagram. No one hashtags #sacrifice. And certainly no one calls a father modern for walking 10 miles home because he spent bus money on his daughter's field trip fee. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling, and whispered, maybe I was never modern enough. Maybe I was never enough, period. The house echoed my words back at me, mocking and hollow. I thought of my father again. He had been a stern man, never saying "I love you" out loud. His love was in the roof over our heads, the food on the table, the silence of a man too tired to talk. When I was a boy, I hated that silence. I swore I would be different, and I was. I showed up. I clapped too loud. I hugged too long. I wrote notes in her lunchbox, corny jokes, silly doodles. I thought I was rewriting the story. But maybe all I did was translate it into another language she never wanted to learn. The more I thought about it, the tighter my chest felt. My daughter saw my money as useful, but my presence as obsolete. She saw my sacrifice as expected, but my affection as outdated. And yet if I stopped giving, what would I be? I stood and paced the room. The old wooden floor creaked under my weight, each groan echoing my unease. I stopped at the bookshelf and pulled down an album. Inside were photographs from every year of her life. Here she was at 3, sitting on my shoulders at the county fair. Here she was at 10, holding up a spelling bee trophy while I stood beside her, grinning like a fool. Here she was at 16, scowling at me because I wouldn't let her date a boy with a motorcycle. I traced the edge of the photos with my finger. I was there, I murmured. Every step I was there. But in her world now I wasn't. I went to the garage, sat on the old workbench, and let the sawdust smell wrap around me. My tools stared back, relics of a man who believed building things with his hands was noble. But my daughter's world was built on different foundations, digital, disposable, curated. Still, something in me rebelled against the idea that my love had expired like an old coupon. I reached for a pen. If I couldn't say it in person, if my words caught in my throat when she looked at me with those dismissive eyes, then maybe I could write it. I found a sheet of lined paper and began. "Sweetheart, I don't know the right words anymore. Maybe I never did. But I want you to know something. Every blister on my hands, every mile I walked, every hour I worked was because of you. Not because it was expected, but because it was love. I know I'm not modern. I know I don't fit into your parties or your world, but when you were little, you fit into my arms. And to me, that was enough. I hope one day you'll see that love doesn't go out of style. It only grows." I stopped, wiped my eyes, and realized the ink had smudged where a tear had fallen. I folded the letter carefully, slid it into an envelope, and placed it beside the wooden rattle on my nightstand. Two gifts, neither modern, neither requested, both carved out of my heart. I turned off the light, lay in bed, and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow, I would decide how to give her these gifts. Tomorrow, I would figure out whether to leave them at her door or keep them hidden forever. But tonight, I finally let the tears fall freely, not for what I had lost, but for what I still refused to give up. Because being a father didn't end when the world stopped noticing. It only ended when the heart stopped trying. And mine hadn't stopped yet. The hardest part of being a father isn't the sleepless nights when your child is young. It isn't the bills or the scraped knees or the impossible balance between work and home. The hardest part is when you still have love to give, but no place to put it. That's what I felt as I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the two objects in front of me, the wooden rattle and the folded letter. They looked so small, so unimpressive compared to the polished gifts my daughter had unwrapped at the shower: diaper cakes shaped like swans, strollers with Bluetooth speakers, designer baby clothes still smelling of boutiques. And yet to me they were everything. The rattle carried my hands, my patience, my memory of building things for her mother. The letter carried my heart, the words I could never say out loud without breaking. Would she accept them? Probably not. She'd call the rattle old-fashioned, the letter sentimental. Maybe she wouldn't even read it, but I couldn't let my grandchild enter the world without at least trying. That evening, I found a box in the closet, an old shoe box from years ago. I lined it with tissue paper, placed the rattle inside, and slid the letter on top. My handwriting looked clumsy against the neatness of the envelope, but it was mine. I wrapped the box in plain brown paper. No ribbons, no glitter. Just something simple, sturdy, true. When I finished, I sat back in the chair, staring at the package. My chest ached as if the weight of decades was pressed into that little box. The clock struck 9. Outside, the world had quieted except for the hum of streetlights and the occasional car passing by. I slipped on my coat, tucked the package under my arm, and stepped out into the cool night. The drive to her house felt longer than usual. Each stoplight seemed to hold me in place, as if the universe was asking, "Are you sure? Are you sure you want to do this?" But I kept going. Her neighborhood was bright even at night, porch lights glowing, yards trimmed to perfection. My truck rumbled awkwardly down the manicured street, a reminder of how out of place I was here too. I parked a block away, not wanting her or her neighbors to see me. Carrying the box felt heavier with every step I took. When I reached her front door, I froze. The porch light cast a warm glow, illuminating a doormat that read, "Welcome, friends." Friends, not fathers. I bent down, placed the box gently against the door. My fingers lingered on it as if I could transfer my heartbeat into the paper. For a moment, I imagined her opening the door, finding me standing there. I imagined her eyes softening, her voice cracking, her arms wrapping around me in forgiveness. But imagination is kinder than reality. Instead, I straightened, knocked once softly, more a whisper of presence than a request, and turned to leave. Halfway down the path, I heard footsteps inside. A shadow crossed the window. My breath caught. If she opened the door right then, she'd see me. She'd see the gift. She'd see everything I couldn't say. I quickened my pace, heart pounding, until I reached the sidewalk. The night air stung my cheeks as I ducked behind the corner of the street, just in time to hear the faint squeak of the door opening. I didn't look back. I walked faster than I had in years, almost jogging toward my truck. My legs burned, my chest tightened, but I didn't stop until I was inside with the door shut, engine humming. From the driver's seat, I stared at my rearview mirror. Her porch light glowed in the distance, the box still visible at her feet. She bent down, picked it up. For a second, I thought she hesitated. Maybe she felt the weight of it, heavier than a simple box should be. Maybe she wondered why the paper was slightly damp from the sweat of my palms. Then the door closed and she was gone. I sat there for a long time, my hands gripping the steering wheel, eyes wet. I had delivered my love like a thief in the night, sneaking it in, praying it would not be discarded. I whispered to the empty truck, "That's all I can give." The silence answered back, and maybe it's enough. The drive home was quiet. The streets were empty, the houses asleep. I thought of my wife again, what she would have said if she saw me leaving that box. "You did the right thing," I imagined her saying. "Love doesn't need an invitation." By the time I pulled into my driveway, a strange calm had settled over me. I had done what I could. The rest was no longer mine to control. Inside, I hung up my coat, sat in the recliner, and closed my eyes. For the first time in weeks, I slept without tossing. Because even if she never read the letter, even if the rattle never touched my grandchild's hand, I had spoken my truth. And sometimes, that's all a father can do. The night I left the package at her door, I thought maybe I'd feel lighter, as though finally giving the gift would untie the knot in my chest. But when I drove home, the quiet inside my house pressed harder than usual. The air felt heavier. The walls seemed farther apart. Even the hum of the refrigerator sounded like loneliness. I hung my coat by the door and stood in the living room, staring at nothing. The chair where my wife used to sit remained empty, its cushion worn in the shape of her body. I sometimes pretended she had just gotten up to make tea and would return any minute, but the silence never lied. I lowered myself into my recliner, the one that creaked in all the same places I did, and closed my eyes. All I saw was my daughter's porch light glowing against the dark. All I felt was the weight of that small box leaving my hands. Would she open it? Would she read the letter? Would she laugh at it, toss it aside? Or maybe, just maybe, press it against her heart the way I had hoped? I didn't know, and not knowing was worse than rejection. I poured myself a glass of water and walked to the window. Outside, the street was quiet, lined with cars asleep under the stars. My neighbor's house still had Christmas lights strung along the gutter, even though it was February. The blinking bulbs looked tired, like they'd been left behind. That was how I felt, left behind. Modern life moved too fast. Parties curated for photos, conversations carried in texts, love measured in emojis. I was a man from another time, stumbling into a world that didn't wait for me. Still, as I leaned against the cold window, I whispered, "Love doesn't expire. It doesn't need to be modern." The glass reflected my face back at me, lined, tired, older than I remembered. But behind the wrinkles, I saw the same man who once carried his daughter on his shoulders, who once held her when she was sick, who once promised her he'd always be there. That man hadn't expired. That love hadn't expired. I turned from the window and walked toward the hallway. The photo of my wife smiled at me from the mantel, the one with her in that sundress. I stopped, touched the frame, and whispered, "I did what I could." Her smile didn't change, but in my mind, I heard her voice, "That's enough." I went to bed earlier than usual, exhausted not from work but from carrying a heart too full with nowhere to set it down. But before I drifted off, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I reached for it, blinking at the screen. It was a message from my daughter. Ba Khan S letter 1 EBDTR letter 1 EA3 L letter 1 EA1 ITI letter 1 EC1 and Sao. No thank you. No mention of the box. No acknowledgement of the letter. Just a transaction, like settling a debt. I stared at the message until the words blurred. For a moment, anger surged. My fists clenched, my jaw tightened. After all I had given, after all I had done, was I nothing more than an ATM? But anger faded quickly, replaced by something heavier, grief. Not grief for myself, but grief for her, for what she was missing. Because one day she'd learn that money can be replaced, but love given freely, clumsily, stubbornly, cannot. I set the phone down without replying. Sleep came in restless waves. Dreams of my daughter as a little girl flashed through my mind. She was laughing in the backyard, chasing bubbles that popped against the summer air. She was tugging my sleeve at the grocery store, begging for candy. She was hugging me tight after her first heartbreak, sobbing into my shirt. In every dream, she looked up at me with trust, with certainty, with love that didn't measure me against the world, only against her need for me. When I woke, the house was filled with gray morning light. The emptiness pressed in again, but the memories lingered like embers refusing to die. I shuffled into the kitchen, made coffee, and sat at the table. The phone still lay there, face down, silent. I picked it up once, then put it back. No new messages. I chuckled bitterly. Guess I'm not modern enough to deserve more than one line. My voice sounded foreign even to me. That afternoon, I went to the garage again. The smell of oak still clung to the air, the unfinished projects watching me like silent companions. I ran my hands over the tools, the same ones I had used to carve the box. Maybe she'll never see it, I told the empty space. But I had to try. I couldn't let the story end with silence. I realized then that love is sometimes less about being received and more about being given. Whether she opened that letter or not, whether she kept the rattle or threw it away, didn't change the truth. I had loved her. I still did. And that love filled my heart even if my house stayed empty. That night before bed, I whispered to my wife's photo again. She sent me a message, I said softly, just about the money, nothing else. In my imagination, my wife smiled the way she used to when I overthought things. Patience, I heard her voice say, patience. Seeds take time to grow. I nodded, though my eyes stung. All right, I whispered. I'll wait, for as long as it takes. A week passed after I left the box at her door. Every morning I woke half expecting a call, a text, some kind of sign that she had opened it. But the phone stayed silent, except for the occasional reminder from the pharmacy or spam about car warranties. The box, the letter, the rattle, none of it was mentioned. Life carried on around me. Neighbors waved from their driveways. The mail arrived in its usual stack of bills and catalogs. The world spun forward without acknowledging that I had poured decades of love into an envelope that might still be sitting unopened. But somewhere else, beyond the reach of my old flip phone and quiet street, something was beginning. It happened the following Sunday afternoon. My daughter had hosted a smaller gathering at her house, some friends dropping by to help sort through leftover gifts and decorations. I wasn't there, of course, but I would learn about it later, through whispers carried back to me in unexpected ways. One of her friends, a young woman named Marissa who had known my daughter since college, was helping tidy the nursery. They were unpacking boxes, folding clothes, arranging trinkets. And then, tucked under a pile of unopened packages, Marissa noticed the plain brown-wrapped box. "What's this?" she asked. My daughter frowned. "Oh, that, it was on my porch last week, probably from Dad." Marissa tilted her head. "Why haven't you opened it?" My daughter shrugged. "It's probably something old-fashioned. You know how he is. I didn't want to deal with it." Marissa picked it up anyway. It was light but firm, the kind of weight that hinted at care rather than expense. She tore the paper gently, revealing the wooden rattle and the folded letter on top. "Wait," my daughter began, but Marissa was already unfolding the paper. Her eyes scanned the words. Her throat tightened. "Sweetheart, I don't know the right words anymore. Maybe I never did, but I want you to know something. Every blister on my hands, every mile I walked, every hour I worked was because of you. Not because it was expected, but because it was love." By the time she reached the end, her voice trembled. She looked at my daughter with wet eyes. "Your dad wrote this. This is beautiful." My daughter shifted uncomfortably, crossing her arms. "It's just Dad being Dad. Just Dad." Marissa repeated, almost incredulous. "Do you realize how rare this is? Some people would give anything for a father who loved them like this." My daughter said nothing. Marissa folded the letter carefully, as if it were made of glass, and slipped it back into the envelope. She placed it against her chest for a moment before whispering, "This shouldn't stay hidden." That night, back in her apartment, Marissa opened her laptop. She went to Reddit, a site where strangers trade stories, advice, and pieces of their lives they might never confess to people they know. She clicked into a forum called r/true off my chest and began typing. She wrote about a father who wasn't invited to his own daughter's baby shower because he was too old-fashioned. She described how he still paid for everything, how he left a plain box on her porch with a wooden rattle and a handwritten letter. Then she typed out the words of the letter, piece by piece, each line raw and unpolished. She ended her post with this: "I don't know this man well, but I know this. Love like his shouldn't be hidden or dismissed. If you have a parent like this, please don't take them for granted, because some of us would give anything to have one more day with a father who cared this much." and with a click she sent it into the endless sea of the internet. By the next morning, the post had hundreds of comments. By evening, thousands. Strangers from all over the world were moved to tears by the story of a quiet father whose love was overlooked. One wrote, "My dad died before I could ever thank him. Please, whoever this daughter is, go hug your father while you still can." Another, "This broke me. My parents never cared, and I would have killed for a wooden rattle and a letter like that." And another, "Modern doesn't mean better. This father is the definition of timeless love." Upvotes poured in, pushing the story to the front page. Articles began to pick it up. Screenshots circulated on other platforms: Facebook, Twitter, even Instagram. The old-fashioned father went viral, and I had no idea. In my small house, I still sat alone. I still checked my phone in vain, still waited for a reply that didn't come. I still whispered to my wife's photo at night, telling her about the silence. Meanwhile, outside my four walls, strangers were calling me the father of the year. 2 days later, I noticed something odd. The cashier at the grocery store gave me a longer smile than usual. The man at the post office patted my shoulder kindly, though I hadn't said a word to him. Even the neighbor across the street, who usually never waved, nodded at me with something like respect. I didn't understand. Had the world shifted while I wasn't looking? That night, I sat in my recliner, holding the old Rattles twin I had kept for myself, unfinished, rough around the edges. I turned it over in my hand, thinking of the letter I had written, wondering if it had ended up in the trash. I didn't know that somewhere, right at that moment, thousands of people across the world were reading it, whispering to themselves, "This is what love looks like." And while I sat in the silence of my house, convinced my love had gone unnoticed, a tide was already rising. A tide that would soon crash into my life in ways I never could have imagined. I didn't know I had gone viral. The phrase itself felt foreign, like something from another language. Viral used to mean the flu, something you caught in winter. Now it meant stories racing across the internet faster than truth or lies could keep up. I only found out because my neighbor, John, knocked on my door one Tuesday morning. He stood on my porch with his phone in his hand, grinning. "You didn't tell me you were famous," he said. "Famous," I repeated. "John, I can't even get my television to turn on half the time." He laughed, shoved the phone toward me. "Look at this." On the screen was a Reddit post, thousands of comments, tens of thousands of upvotes. At the top was the headline: "Her father wasn't invited to the baby shower because he was too old-fashioned. He still paid for everything. Then he left her a wooden rattle and a handwritten letter." Beneath it were the words I had written, my words, my letter. For a second, the world spun, my throat closed. "Where did you get this?" I whispered. "It's everywhere, man," John said. "People are calling you the father of the year. There are articles, videos, even podcasts talking about you." I sank onto the porch steps, staring at the tiny letters glowing on his screen. My letter, my love, out there for strangers to read. That afternoon, I borrowed my neighbor's laptop. My old flip phone wasn't built for this world, and searched my name. I didn't find it, of course. No one knew who I was, but the story, my story, was everywhere. Comments scrolled endlessly. "This man deserves all the love in the world. Modern doesn't mean better. This father is timeless. I wish I had a dad like this." Some people wrote paragraphs about their own fathers, distant, absent, abusive, and how reading my letter cracked something open in them. Others said they were calling their dads right then just to say thank you. I leaned back in my chair, overwhelmed. Here I was, sitting in an empty house, convinced my love had gone unnoticed, and yet strangers across the world were holding it in their hands like it was treasure. It was humbling, it was surreal, and it was bittersweet, because the one person I had written it for hadn't said a word. That night I sat in my recliner, the laptop glowing on my lap. My chest felt both heavy and light, heavy with the years of silence between me and my daughter, light with the knowledge that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't crazy for believing my love still mattered. I closed my eyes and whispered to the photo of my wife on the mantel, "They see me, love, they see me." For the first time in months I smiled. What I didn't know, what I couldn't know, was that my daughter had seen it too. Late that same night, she sat on her bed, scrolling through her phone. Her friends had been buzzing all day about that viral dad, sending her links asking if it was hers. At first, she had ignored them, but curiosity wore her down. When she opened the post, her breath caught. There it was, the brown box she had set aside, the rattle she had dismissed, the letter she hadn't finished reading, and thousands of strangers telling her father he was everything she had failed to say. Her eyes blurred. Tears slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them. She pressed the phone to her chest, shaking, whispering, "Dad." But she didn't call me. Not yet. Pride is a stubborn wall, and guilt builds it higher. So she cried silently, clutching her phone, while in another house just miles away I smiled softly, thinking the world was kinder than I deserved. The next morning I went for a walk. People nodded at me with unfamiliar warmth. A teenager passing on a bike shouted, "Hey, I read about you, you're awesome." I chuckled, bewildered. My world had been so small, so quiet, and suddenly it had cracks of light spilling in. But the brightest light was still missing, the voice of my daughter. I went home, brewed coffee, and sat by the phone. I told myself I wouldn't hope, but hope doesn't listen. It just sits in your chest, stubborn as a heartbeat. The knock came on a Thursday morning. It was soft at first, like the tapping of branches against glass. I almost didn't hear it. I was in the kitchen, pouring coffee into a chipped mug, half listening to the radio hum a song from the '70s. Then it came again. Louder. I frowned, set the mug down, and shuffled to the door. Visitors were rare in my world. Most of the time, the only sounds outside my house were the postman's steps or the neighbor's lawnmower. When I opened the door, I froze. There she was, my daughter, standing on the porch, her belly round beneath a soft sweater, her eyes rimmed with red, and in her hand, folded and wrinkled, was the letter I had left in the box. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The world held its breath. Then she whispered, "Dad." Her voice cracked on the single word. I gripped the door frame, unsure whether I was dreaming. She looked so young and so old at once, my little girl, my grown daughter, the soon-to-be mother who still carried pieces of the child she once was. She started, then stopped. Her throat worked, her hand tightening on the letter. Finally, the words tumbled out, broken and wet with tears. "I'm sorry." I didn't move, didn't speak. My heart pounded so hard I thought she might hear it echo in the doorway. "For everything," she continued. "For shutting you out, for saying you weren't modern enough, for making you feel like money was all I wanted." Her face crumpled. "I was wrong, Dad. I was so wrong." The letter shook in her hand as she held it out to me. I didn't read it that night. I couldn't, but then I saw it. Online, everyone saw it. And I realized, she swallowed hard. I realized I've had what people are begging for, and I threw it away. I reached out, slowly, carefully, as if she might vanish. My fingers brushed the paper, then her hand. It was warm, trembling. "You read it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Every word," and I couldn't stop crying. "Because you've been here all along, and I treated you like a stranger, but you're not. You're my dad. You've always been my dad." Something broke inside me then, not in pain, but in release. The wall I had built to keep from drowning in disappointment crumbled, and love came rushing in like a flood. I stepped forward and pulled her into my arms. She buried her face in my chest, sobbing. My hands, rough and clumsy, rested on her back. I held her the way I had when she was 5 and woke from nightmares, the way I had when she was 12 and scraped her knee, the way I had always wanted to, without condition, without fear of being unwanted. "SHHH," I whispered, though my own tears blurred my vision. "You're here now, that's enough." We stood there in the doorway, time folding in on itself. She was a child and a woman all at once. I was a father and a grandfather to be, and the world felt both brand new and impossibly old. When we finally pulled apart, she looked at me through wet lashes. "I don't want modern if it means losing you," she said. "I need you, Dad. My baby needs you." The words pierced me, but this time like light through clouds. "I'll be here," I said, steady as I could. "Always." We moved inside. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded over her belly while I poured her a glass of water. For a moment it felt like the past and present had merged, her sitting there like she used to as a teenager, except now she carried life within her. I didn't know it went online, I admitted, sliding the glass toward her. She smiled faintly, embarrassed. Marissa posted it. She said it was too beautiful to stay hidden, and she was right. I shook my head in disbelief. All these years, I thought I was invisible, and now strangers know me better than my own daughter. She winced. I know, and I hate that, but I don't want it to stay that way. She placed her hand over mine. I want to fix this if you'll let me. I squeezed her hand gently. Sweetheart, you don't have to earn my love. It's yours. It always has been. We sat together for a long while, the silence no longer heavy but healing. At one point, she picked up the rattle from the box, turning it over in her hand. It's perfect, she whispered. I didn't see it before, but now I do. I smiled, a lump rising in my throat. I made it for little hands, just like I once made things for yours. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and for the first time in years I felt whole. As evening fell, she stood to leave. At the door, she turned back, eyes shining. Dad, will you come with me when the baby's born? I want you there. My chest tightened, but this time with joy. Of course, I said softly. I wouldn't miss it for the world. She hugged me again before stepping into the night, the letter tucked safely in her bag. I closed the door slowly, leaning against it, tears of gratitude wetting my face. For years, I had carried love with no place to set it down. Now I had been given a place again. And this time I wasn't letting go. Hospitals have a way of reminding you how fragile and miraculous life is at the same time. The smell of antiseptic, the echo of hurried footsteps, the hum of machines, it all felt foreign to me. Yet as I sat in the waiting room that morning, my heart drummed with a rhythm I had known before, the rhythm of waiting to meet a child. Except this time it wasn't my child. It was hers. My daughter had called me 2 nights earlier. Her voice was steadier than it had been in months, but still threaded with nerves. Dad, she had said, it's time. Will you come with me? I didn't hesitate, of course. And so here I was, a bag of nerves disguised as an old man in a plaid shirt, waiting for the sound that would change everything. Hours passed. Nurses moved in and out of the room down the hall. My daughter's partner stood beside her, holding her hand, but every so often she'd glance at me and I'd nod, silent reassurance the way fathers do. I sat quietly praying the only prayer I knew, please let them both be safe. Please let me hold this child in my arms. At last the cry came, high, sharp, insistent, the sound of a life announcing itself to the world. My chest broke open, tears filled my eyes before I even stood. I pressed my hands to my face, whispering, thank you, God, thank you. A nurse appeared at the door, smiling. Grandpa, would you like to meet your grandchild? Grandpa. The word rolled over me like sunlight. I followed her into the room. My daughter lay on the bed, exhausted, glowing, her hair damp with sweat. She looked at me with weary eyes that still managed to sparkle. Dad, she whispered, meet your granddaughter. And then the nurse placed the bundle in my arms. She was impossibly small, her skin soft, her eyelids fluttering like the wings of a moth. A tiny fist peeked out of the blanket, curling around nothing and everything at once. I held her against my chest, and suddenly I was 30 years younger, standing in a hospital room holding my own daughter for the first time. The same trembling hands, the same overflowing heart. I bent my head close and whispered, welcome, little one. You don't know me yet, but I've been waiting for you all my life. My daughter watched me, tears streaking her cheeks. She nodded toward the wooden rattle on the side table, the one I had left on her porch weeks ago. I want that to be her first toy, she said softly. I swallowed hard, my throat thick. You're sure? Yes, she said, because love doesn't go out of style. The words struck deep. Later, when the room quieted, I sat in the corner chair, rocking gently with my granddaughter in my arms. My daughter slept, her chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. The baby made small sounds, sighs too delicate to belong to this loud world. I thought of my wife then, how she would have adored this moment. I imagined her hand on my shoulder, her voice whispering, see, the love you gave still lives on, 3 generations, one circle unbroken at last. I kissed the baby's forehead and closed my eyes. For years I had feared my love was too old, too clumsy, too invisible. But in that moment, I knew the truth. Love is never outdated. It doesn't need to be modern. It only needs to be given, and given again and again. As I handed my granddaughter back to her mother, I whispered one last thing to the child who had no words yet. Someday, when the world tells you what's new, what's modern, what's worth chasing, remember this: the truest things are often the oldest, and love, little one, never expires. I kissed her tiny hand, let it curl around my finger, and smiled through my tears. Because in that moment, in that room, surrounded by past and future, I finally understood. I wasn't left behind. I was exactly where I was meant to be.